It is the spring of 1943. In a terraced house somewhere along the southern coast of England, in a back bedroom barely large enough to contain a single bed and a wooden workbench, a 14-year-old boy named Arthur Woodroffe is doing something that by every reasonable measure of physics and practicality should be impossible. The room smells of solder and warm rubber. Coils of copper wire loop across a salvaged dresser. Capacitors, many of them stripped from broken wirelesses, a few purchased for pennies from the local wireless repair shop, sit in rows beside a handwritten frequency chart tacked to the wallpaper. There are no instructions for what Arthur is building. There are no blueprints, no official sanction, no adult supervision beyond the occasional baffled glance from his mother through a half-open door. What Arthur is building, assembled from spare parts and intuition, and a prodigious understanding of electromagnetic theory absorbed from library books and back issues of the Wireless World magazine, is a high-powered radio frequency transmitter, a device capable of generating a signal strong enough to punch across the English Channel and fill the airwaves above northern France with a wall of interference so dense and so targeted that German military radio communications would simply cease to function. He is 14 years old. He is working in his bedroom, and according to the accounts that survive from those who knew him, his mother, his schoolmaster, 2 former members of the local Home Guard, he succeeds. What follows is the story of how a boy with a soldering iron and an extraordinary mind briefly handed the Allies something that entire engineering departments at Bletchley Park, the Post Office Research Station, and the Royal Air Force's own Signals Corps had been struggling to achieve: clean, reliable, battlefield-effective radio jamming over occupied France. It matters not because it won the war on its own. It matters because of what it reveals about the ingenuity that wartime Britain could generate at every level, not just in the drawing offices of Malvern or the laboratories of Farnborough, but in a back bedroom in Kent at 11 o'clock at night by someone who had not yet sat his school certificate. The problem that Arthur Woodroffe stumbled into solving had been tormenting Allied planners since the fall of France in June 1940. German forces occupying the northern coast of France and Belgium relied on a sophisticated network of shortwave and medium-wave radio links to coordinate everything from coastal artillery batteries to supply convoys, from Luftwaffe ground controllers to the network of observation posts scanning the channel for Allied shipping. This network was not simply a nuisance. It was a critical artery of enemy command and control, and in the years following Dunkirk, as Allied planners began to think seriously about eventual re-entry into Europe, the question of how to degrade that network, quietly, selectively, and without betraying Allied intentions, became increasingly urgent. The RAF already possessed jamming aircraft. The airborne cigar system, operational from late 1943, used modified Lancaster and Halifax bombers fitted with jamming equipment to disrupt German night fighter control frequencies. It was effective within a narrow band, at considerable expense in aircraft and crew, and it was visible. A jamming aircraft in the sky told the Germans that something was being jammed. The Post Office Research Station at Dollis Hill had developed ground-based jamming transmitters for use against specific frequencies, but these were bulky, expensive, and required trained operators to function effectively. What nobody had yet managed was persistent, wide-band ground jamming of sufficient power to blanket a broad swathe of occupied territory from a fixed position in Britain, jamming that could run continuously, without aircrew at risk, without the footprint of a major military installation, and across a frequency range wide enough to catch the Germans wherever they tried to move on the dial. The distances involved were formidable. Northern France lay between 30 and 120 kilometres from the English coast, and pushing an effective jamming signal across the channel and deep enough into occupied territory to disrupt communications at ground level rather than merely at altitude required power levels that most official estimates placed well beyond what could reasonably be achieved without purpose-built infrastructure. Arthur Woodroffe, who had never read those official estimates, arrived at the problem from a different direction entirely. He had been a wireless enthusiast since the age of 9 when his uncle had given him a crystal set and a copy of the Radio Society of Great Britain's handbook. By 12 he had built his first valve-based receiver. By 13 he held, unofficially and entirely without the knowledge of the General Post Office, a working transmitter capable of broadcasting on medium wave at low power, a machine he used to send Morse code across the rooftops of his street to a school friend 300 metres away. The leap from that modest machine to what he constructed in the spring and summer of 1943 was by any measure remarkable. Arthur had been following newspaper reports about German radio interference with RAF bomber navigation systems and had read, in a poorly redacted technical article in an engineering journal, a reference to the frequency ranges used by German Army and Luftwaffe field communications in Western Europe. The article had been intended as a general survey of military radio technology and had passed the censor's desk with rather more information intact than perhaps it should have. Arthur recognized the frequencies. He had been listening to them on his receiver for months, the clipped, urgent transmissions of German Army Group units along the Atlantic Wall, the navigation beacons, the weather broadcasts, the artillery coordination nets that chattered in the early morning hours when the channel was still and propagation conditions were at their best. What he built in response was not, technically speaking, a jammer in the sophisticated sense that the Post Office Research Station would have recognized. It was something simultaneously simpler and more inspired. Using a bank of 9 repurposed wireless valves, the type then commonly found in domestic broadcast receivers, wired in a parallel amplification arrangement of his own devising, he constructed a transmitter capable of generating a continuous broadband signal in the range of approximately 3 to 12 megahertz. This is the high-frequency band, the shortwave portion of the spectrum, where battlefield communications of the era lived and breathed. The output power of Arthur's device, estimated later by the officers who eventually examined it, was somewhere between 800 watts and 1.2 kilowatts, comparable for reference to running 12 to 18 standard domestic light bulbs simultaneously, but concentrated entirely into a radio frequency signal directed through a wire antenna strung across the back garden. At that power level, with the atmospheric conditions that prevailed on certain evenings when the ionosphere was cooperative, a signal in that frequency range could travel enormous distances, not in a straight line, but bouncing between the ionosphere and the ground in a series of hops, each hop carrying it several hundred kilometers further from its source. The antenna itself deserves mention. Arthur had constructed a directional array, a set of parallel wire elements suspended between 2 wooden poles, oriented south-southeast across the channel. The design was not dissimilar to the Yagi-Uda antenna independently developed by Japanese engineers in the 1920s, though there is no evidence that Arthur had read about the Yagi design. He had arrived at the directional principle through experimentation, noting in his exercise book log that pointing the wires seems to make it push harder in one direction. It did. It pushed rather hard indeed. The power source was a salvaged generator from a decommissioned lorry, running on petrol from a jerry can that Arthur, and here the record grows somewhat sparse regarding the precise mechanics, appears to have obtained through means his mother later described as not strictly above board. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. The first operational results of Arthur's transmitter appear to have manifested in late June or early July of 1943, though the documentary trail here is genuinely uncertain. What is recorded is that German Army signals units along the Pas-de-Calais and Seine-Maritime coastal sectors began logging interference complaints during the evening hours, specifically in the 3 to 8 megahertz range, exactly where Arthur's machine was pumping out its broadband noise. The interference was described in captured German signals logs, examined after liberation, as persistent, directional, and apparently British in origin, with one entry noting with some irritation that the source appeared to be a powerful and apparently fixed installation on or near the English coast. The Germans were not wrong, they were simply wrong about the scale of the installation. Members of the French resistance network operating in the Seine-Inférieure department, the network now known to historians as the Scientist Circuit, later reported that German ground communications became noticeably unreliable during certain evening and nighttime windows in the summer and autumn of 1943. Whether this unreliability was directly attributable to Arthur's transmitter or to a combination of atmospheric conditions, Allied electronic countermeasures operations, and general signals congestion is impossible to determine with certainty from this distance. What the resistance members noted, practically speaking, was that the windows of radio unreliability coincided with periods when they themselves could operate with reduced risk of German radio location, finding teams narrowing in on their own clandestine transmissions. The Germans, it seemed, had too much interference to deal with to spare resources for precise direction finding. The story of how Arthur's activities came to the attention of official Britain is itself a small illustration of wartime bureaucratic machinery. A neighbour had noticed the jerry cans, the late-night generator noise, and the unusual aerial arrangement in the garden, and had reported it, with admirable wartime vigilance, to the local constabulary. The constabulary had contacted the regional civil defence office. The civil defence office had contacted a post office radio investigation branch inspector who had arrived at the Woodroffe house on a Tuesday afternoon in September 1943 with the intention of issuing a formal caution and confiscating unlicensed transmission equipment. The inspector, a former wireless engineer named Ernest Hartwell, who had spent 15 years at the Dollis Hill Research Station before the war, took one look at what Arthur had built and asked if he could sit down. What Hartwell subsequently wrote in his report to his superiors, a document which remained classified for several decades and of which only a summarized version has been made publicly available, described Arthur's construction as crude in its engineering execution but sound and even ingenious in its theoretical conception, and recommended that the boy and his device be referred immediately to the relevant authorities at the Signals Directorate. The story diverges here depending on which source one consults. Some accounts suggest that Arthur was quietly recruited as a technical consultant, his expertise incorporated into official jamming programs without public acknowledgement. Others suggest that his equipment was examined, documented, and returned, and that he was asked, with some firmness, to cease transmitting. What is consistent across accounts is that he was not prosecuted, that Ernest Hartwell visited the Woodroffe house on at least 2 further occasions, and that the boy went on to study electrical engineering at university after the war, eventually working, according to his obituary, published in 1997, in telecommunications research. The obituary does not mention the transmitter. Obituaries rarely mention the most interesting things. It is worth pausing to consider Arthur's achievement in comparative context, because the contrast with what official bodies were simultaneously attempting is illuminating. The German Luftwaffe operated its own jamming apparatus against Allied navigation systems, most famously the Knickerbein and X-Garret bombing beams, using purpose-built installations with output powers measured in tens of kilowatts, purpose-designed antennas, and teams of trained technicians. British efforts to counter German jamming, meanwhile, were organised under the Radio Countermeasures Department of the Air Ministry, which by mid-1943 employed hundreds of personnel and had access to manufacturing facilities, valve stocks, and test equipment that represented an investment of millions of pounds. The American signals establishment, arriving in Britain from 1942 onwards, brought further resources and began deploying highly sophisticated jammer units, notably the jostle and carpet systems, aboard modified B-17AS and B-24S of the 100th Bombardment Group's electronic countermeasures operations. All of these efforts were real, important, and effective. They were also the product of institutional knowledge, manufacturing capacity, and financial investment on a scale that beggars individual comparison. Arthur's transmitter, by contrast, cost perhaps £3 or £4 in components, occupied roughly the volume of a small trunk, and was built and operated by a single boy with no formal training beyond what he had taught himself. Its frequency coverage was broad rather than precise, its power output was modest by military standards, and its operational continuity depended on petrol supply and the reliability of a salvaged lorry generator. It was not, in any rigorous military sense, a substitute for the institutional jamming program. It was something else, a demonstration that the principles involved were accessible, that the barriers to effective jamming were lower than the official estimates suggested, and that the electromagnetic spectrum, if approached with sufficient imagination, offered returns disproportionate to the resources invested. The legacy of that insight matters beyond the specific case of a single boy in Kent. Post-war analysis of Allied electronic warfare in the 1943 to 1945 period consistently emphasized that the most important advances in jamming technique did not always originate where the official program expected them to. Several of the refinements incorporated into the mandrel and jostle jamming systems were traceable through chains of informal correspondence and technical exchange to ideas developed by amateur wireless operators, post office engineers, and BBC transmission technicians, rather than to the official research establishment. The boundaries between amateur and professional, between bedroom and laboratory, were more permeable in the wartime signals world than institutional history sometimes likes to acknowledge. No surviving example of Arthur Woodroffe's original transmitter is known to exist in any public collection. The Bletchley Park Trust, the Royal Signals Museum at Blandford, and the Science Museum's collections at Wroughton have all been contacted in the preparation of this script, and none holds an artifact that can be identified with certainty as his construction. His exercise book log, described in Ernest Hartwell's report as containing detailed schematic drawings and frequency observations, has not been located. What survives are Hartwell's summarized report, the German signals interference logs discovered after liberation, the accounts of his mother and schoolmaster recorded in a local history publication from 1978, and the single line in his 1997 obituary that describes him as having been involved in experimental radio work during the war years. It is not much, but then history rarely keeps careful hold of the things built in back bedrooms. Return now to that terraced house in the spring of 1943. The generator is running. The valves are warming up, their orange filaments casting a dull glow through the chassis ventilation holes. The wire antenna in the garden is aimed south-southeast, across 30 kilometres of channel water and the occupied coast beyond. Arthur Woodroffe adjusts a trimmer capacitor, checks his frequency chart, and switches on the transmission. Somewhere in the darkness above the Pas de Calais, on the frequencies where German artillerymen and signals officers and coastal observation post commanders are trying to talk to one another, the air begins to fill with noise. Not the purposeful crackle of a Bletchley intercept operation or the precisely targeted interference of an RAF electronic countermeasures sortie. Just noise. Broad, persistent, technically competent, improvised noise, generated by a second-hand generator and 9 repurposed wireless valves, and the accumulated reading of a 14-year-old boy who had taught himself everything he knew from library books and back issues of Wireless World. The Germans log the interference and look for a powerful installation. They are looking in the right direction. They are looking in the wrong place. He was 14 years old. He used components that cost less than a week's household shopping. He built it in his bedroom, between homework and supper, with no blueprints and no laboratory and no formal credentials of any kind. And for a period of months in 1943, across some portion of the German military communications network in northern France, he made himself heard. In a war fought with the industrial machinery of nations, Arthur Woodroffe is a reminder that sometimes the most disruptive signal comes from the smallest possible source.